Hello, everybody, and welcome to another video. So in this video, I am responding to something that Once Bitten said in one of his recent videos. He sort of was talking about the idea of expanding 9th edition and, a new edition of traditional Warhammer fantasy battles, carrying it on. And I like that idea very much. I think that's awesome, and I love the community involvement. And amongst his points about, does Games Workshop has it actually made a living game, he was talking about some of the downsides. And one of the things he said was that, he thought Games Workshop's prices were too high. And he said Vince Venturella disagrees with me. And he invited me to make a video in response to that. So here you go. So in this video, we're going to talk about Games Workshop's prices. I expect this to be a very not liked video. So I'm going to try to handle this as factually based as I can. And yeah, let's just look at some stuff. Let's look at some data. So I spent some time collecting some data, and let's take a look. So this is a lot of colored cells in Excel, everybody's favorite little thing. And we're going to talk about prices, and we're going to get down to some hard number crunching here. So get ready for that. That should be exciting. Tuck in because we're about to talk about some numbers. So let's do some level setting first. I collected all of these prices off of the various stores where you can buy these things, like mainly War Store, Warhammer themselves, places like that. I used in-stock models. I selected most of the units fairly at random. They are, I'm picking the things, the sort of the top games around right now to compare. So I'm comparing Warhammer with Age of Sigmar, or 8th edition, Malifaux, Infinity, War Machine Hordes, and Kings of War. A note on sort of the quality of the figs. We're not going to talk about that. Now, I personally believe Games Workshop makes some of the best figs on the market. However, I certainly think that many of these other people also make quite beautiful figs. And so realistically, we're going to get into a level of aesthetics, and I don't have any hard numbers around aesthetics. So we are just going to talk about the actual numbers themselves. Okay? As opposed to the quality of the sculpt or how beautiful the fig is. I understand there are differences. We are simply going to ignore them. Okay? Yeah, that might have a very big impact to you. But again, for the purposes of this, we're going to judge based solely on price. Okay? The next thing I will say is that I'll kind of talk about the columns here. So price is just the raw retail price. I understand that you can get these things cheaper. I know that. Most stores offer discounts, usually 20%, something in that range. We're not taking that into account. Because if we were going to take that into account, then Warhammer would win hands down. Because there is no secondhand market as big as there is for Warhammer. Hence, there is more availability. Hence, prices are driven down. The reality is, if I was just doing a price per model comparison and I brought eBay into this equation or Bartertown, Warhammer would crush everyone. But I'm not doing that. We're going to talk retail prices here because that's what Games Workshop or these other companies have control over. In the first little section here where I say number of figs, anytime you see that, that's just the number of figs in that particular package. Playable is meaning, like, when I buy this, is it a playable thing all by itself? Okay, so did I get enough to actually play the game simply by purchasing this one thing? That's a question yes, no of. PPM is price per miniature. And then as we move down, you'll see number of boxes needed. In general, what that means is how many of those boxes do you need to make an actual unit of the thing, a truly playable minimum unit of the thing. This is obviously varied. If you disagree with my exact number on this, that's okay. I don't That's fine. If you think 20 is enough for a unit and you don't need a horde or whatever the example might be, that's also fine. You can ignore that particular component. And then total investment just represents the price times the number of boxes needed. And then I have some notes where we need to talk through it. So I think that handles all of the columns. We're going to walk through all of this individually. So my initial supposition, to lead with my thesis statement, it is thusly. Games Workshop's prices are completely fair, and in fact, probably often undercosted. They have a lot of opportunities at low price per miniature given the rest of the market. And what actually kills them has nothing to do with price per miniature and everything to do with the actual number of miniatures you needed. That is to say, the model that was 8th edition required a huge amount of figures. And it was not only the overwhelming number of those figures, but then the time that was created, the time sink that was created to then bring those figures up to something playable that made the game have an almost unattainable barrier of entry. But in terms of price per miniature, I would submit that they are quite fair. And I hope that at the end of this, you see where I'm drawing this from and why the move with Age of Sigmar, where you can play much smaller forces, helps to bring them back in line with the rest of the market. Because the reality is that if their price per miniature is exactly the same as everybody else, which it's not, it's often lower or at least, you know, similar-ish. But you need 5 or 10 times as many models, okay, then that's not a fault of Games Workshop. Just because their game happened to require you to have a ton of figs doesn't mean that they can suddenly produce their miniatures for 10% of the cost. That's not how the world works. You know, the thing has a cost, and they have to pay it. And we do if we want to buy it. And if we don't want to buy it, don't pay it. That's the beauty of, you know, sort of capitalism, as it were. All right, so let's get into some hard numbers here. At the top, I've got sort of starter kits. In other words, the thing that lets you start playing the game. So I'm going to go ahead and use the Age of Sigmar. That's the first box set. Retails for $125, contains 47 figs, playable out of the box. Price per miniature, $2.66. So the reality is I think this is about one of the best deals on the market today. And this little chart bears that out. Malifaux also just released a new starter kit. I think it just came out actually at Gen Con. It's $65, contains 8 models. It is playable. It has 2 factions. It's actually quite fun. I played a demo with that game at Gen Con and loved it enough that I actually bought into Malifaux and bought an army. So clearly I must have had a good time. So it is playable. But obviously at 8 figs for that money, you know, your price per miniature is $8.13, almost the highest here. You do, however, get some other things in there. So to be fair, you know, you have the other accoutrement. Most of these boxes beyond figs also do have other accoutrement you need to play the games. So I don't want to push that to the side. There's other stuff in there. And that comes in really big in the next one with Infinity and Operation Ice Storm, whatever it is. They're big box, which is also very cool and does contain some like truly beautiful miniatures. I know I'm not counting that, but I do really love Infinity's miniatures. Number of figs is 14. Yes, again, it is playable. And that is actually the highest price per mini at $8.57. However, again, that's unfair because it also actually comes with scenery kits. So I don't know how to price that. But I mean, you're getting like a fair amount of scenery in that box. So again, probably explains the higher PPM. War Machine Hordes, their 2-player starter box is $100, contains 17 figs, certainly playable. I will admit I have not a lot of knowledge of War Machine and Hordes, but from what I could kind of research and find online, it seemed to be about 20-ish points, so probably 20 to 30. I don't really know. People who know War Machine Hordes, you can probably tell me. My understanding is that the game is played at 2 different points levels commonly, 35 and 50. So clearly there would need to be additional investment there, as is really the case with all of these, right? None of these are like, hey, you buy the thing and you're done forever. I mean, obviously all of these are going to require some additional investment. So, it's the same with Malifaux. Certainly those 4 figs aren't your 50 points or whatever you have per game, your 50 coins worth of crew you hire. And then finally, Kings of War and their starter armies. So these are the smaller, currently existing starter armies. I base this off of what was existing now, as opposed to what will be the post-Kickstarter things. Those are a little different. There are mega armies and stuff like that. It's a little more complicated. But at any rate, for now, I'm just going to go with the pre-Old World starter army because that was the one that's still out and available. $85 for 48 figs. Truly the lowest price per mini. However, to be completely fair, you do need to buy 2 of these to, actually play the game. Like there's all the rest of these actually have both sides in the box. This one does not. It has, one full army in it. And it should also be noted that, clearly the game can contain hordes and stuff like that. In Kings of War, you can have 10, 20, and 40 man blocks. And it should be noted that this one only contains up to the 20 model things. So I think of all of them, that one, honestly, even though it has the lowest price per miniature, is kind of the biggest trick because it requires the largest investment to actually be playable. That is to say, you got to buy 2 of them and you have to really expand it out. But right there, I mean, I think in this realm, it's probably fairly clear, Age of Sigmar is really one of the best box sets as far as just actual cost goes in a long time. Just the sheer number of minis and everything you get is really pretty beyond the pale. So let's move down. But that's not what we're talking about. That's just a starter thing, right? And when most people talk about this, they're talking about, the boxes for the individual stuff. Okay. So let's talk about Warhammer individual units. Again, I just ran around and grabbed some stuff, just some units. If you don't like what I grabbed, I'm sure you could construe an example set that tilts things more in one direction or the other. I really just tried to legitimately grab a range of different troops from different armies, okay? I did, however, focus a little on some of the newer stuff because, to be fair, I wanted to weight this a little more toward the newer things. So you look at the Retributors and the Liberators, which are the new Stormcast Eternals, and in those cases, those are probably your worst deals at price per miniature, right? You're getting 5 of them for $58 and $50 respectively, resulting in, really the highest PPM by quite a long measure. What I think is notable about these is that in both cases, you do not really need to buy a lot of these units. So this gets to that number of boxes needed. A full Stormcast Eternal army really isn't very big. And you might be saying, well, what am I judging that by? There's no points value to build things on. Well, I'm judging that based on if I buy the starter box, the AOS, which if I'm going to buy a Stormcast Eternal army, why in the world would I not do that? And then I just need to probably add 1 box of these if. And just sort of the average size of what I'm basing that on is the average size of most of the comp I see flying around of how people are structuring this. You just don't need that many of these guys to fill up the average compacts I see for a lot of these things that are going around. So that's where I got that from. So even though, yes, price per fig is higher, you're buying less boxes of them, which is a model that a lot of these other games go to. And we'll see that down below. So then, moving down from there, there's certainly plenty of examples of cheaper troops as you move through the Warhammer range. You've got things like your Daemonettes, which you get 10 of them for basically $30. So you get $3 price per mini. However, the problem is that realistically, you're going to need to buy a minimum of sort of 3 of those to have a really usable unit on the table. Even if you're playing an Age of Sigmar where you're sort of comped at 30 wounds, right? And when you look at that, then suddenly they become a less good deal because now you're up to the sort of $87 range. Whereas I can get 30 wounds here out of 1 box of these guys plus what's in the starter box. Phoenix Guard are part, and Black Orcs are part of the more elite infantry at $41, clocking in at $4.10 per mini. Again, you know, more expensive in the GW range, but when we get down into the other games, you're going to see that's still actually pretty cheap. The problem is, again, if you're playing in sort of a world where you really need a lot of these guys, if you're building 40-man or 50-man bricks for hordes, it's going to skyrocket up. Even as it is, now the advantage is, in a sort of Age of Sigmar game, you could easily be running around with 20 of these guys and have them be a usable unit. And so much better deal overall as far as cost investment goes. And then just to show that not, some people might look at these two and say, well, doesn't this set the trend for how everything's going to be priced? No, I don't think so. We just got the Blood Reaver pricing confirmed, and the Blood Reavers, which again are out of the Age of Sigmar box set, are $58 for 20, which frankly is actually an amazing deal for their sculpt. That kit is new, it's great. I know I said I wasn't going to talk about the quality of it, but just raw, you know, pounds of plastic or whatnot, 20 of those guys at $2.90 a piece. I mean, certainly I think sub $3 a fig, when you, especially when you look down this list, is a perfectly good deal. So moving down into Malifaux, you have your crew boxes, which is generally a master and some number of other people. So I picked up 2 of these, and I'm very excited about them. Can't wait to get them painted up. But in general, I pinned the number of figs at 6. As I say over here, though, in my notes, though, you know, that's not really true. They're actually more like 5 to 8, depending on, you know, the crew you're recruiting and whatnot. So like the Gremlins have 8 guys in their box, but they tend to be little goblin dudes. Whereas some of the bigger, you know, the crews with bigger figs have less, like 5. But either way, I went ahead and set the average at 6 just to be sort of fair about it, because it looked like most were 5 to 7. So that leads us to an 833. If we look over the rest of these guys, what you see are things like the Rotten Bells. You know, you get 2 of these miniatures in the box, and they're $21 retail. So I mean, $10.50 per. And there's a good selection of these, like 2 for 21 or 2 for 18. There's both of those kind of sets exist. And in either case, you're looking at $9 or $10 at price per miniature. I mean, that's crushing everything up here except this new stuff. And again, like I said, that's, at that point, you're actually fairly in line with the Liberators and the Retributors, right? I mean, these are actually quite in line with these newest kits at raw price per mini. And in both cases, you don't need a lot of these to fill out your crew. Now, Malifaux obviously has sort of this cross incentive where, because you build your army very much like you build your army in Age of Sigmar, where you sort of pick your crew and then you set your schemes and such, and then you build your actual force with your you know, your 50 points, as it were. It does somewhat behoove you to buy a larger number of minis so you have more and varied crews available to achieve your schemes. But I mean, you know, I'm not going to actually hold that against Malifaux, because I think that's perfectly fine. It's not a huge penalty to just, you know, have a reasonable sized crew and call it a day, and that's what you have. I think that's what actually most people do, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So, but my point being is that, you know, that's why I didn't say you need more boxes, because it's not really needed. Wanted and needed are 2 separate things. So I'm trying to go for like a, in business terms, like a minimum viable product here, right? And so what's getting us to the minimum for this? So now let's move down to Mantic. Now, Mantic is obviously the low-cost alternative. And when you compare Games Workshop and Mantic, I mean, it's obvious that in a lot of cases, Mantic is simply going to come out cheaper. I don't think that can much be argued with. In almost all of these cases, Mantic has some just ridiculously low-priced minis. I mean, it is true. And there are some overlap here. You know, what they're basically looking at is some of these you get down into like the $1.25 range or somewhere in that area, and you get up to about $3 or $4 at the high-end range for their their sort of core, their infantry, their knights, whatever, that kind of stuff, the more elite-ish stuff. And so, but if you look at it, that's not that different than the range needed here on these troops. I mean, this is running, it skews a little higher, certainly, but I mean, not much. It's really on average about $1 higher-ish in the price per mini. So I'll leave that to, and obviously what you need here as far as army size, you know, if we're going to compare apples to apples, so if you were to compare it to 8th edition, it's pretty similar. That is to say, Kings of War 2nd edition, you probably often have a similar number of troops on the table as to what you had in a game of Warhammer 8th edition. You know, would vary depending on the points, obviously, in both cases, but it's close-ish. And so I think what's notable there is that, you know, they're very competitive with what is the obvious low-cost alternative on the market. Yes, these newer figs skew much higher, but again, price per mini can be misleading when you need to buy multiple boxes of these things, because in the end, this isn't what comes out of your wallet. Like, despite the fact that I've highlighted it, but I did that just for easy comparison, this is what comes out of your wallet, right? And how many of those things you need to buy are what's relevant. And in a lot of cases, they're going to work out, you know, very similar to your total cost investment. I will leave it to you, the viewer, to decide whether or not you think the sculpts are actually worth any difference there or not, or the value or the rules or whatever, because really the figs are interchangeable, so the rules don't matter much. You can use Mantic figs in Warhammer, and you can use Warhammer figs in Mantic. So, I mean, at that point, I think you're literally just deciding on price and aesthetic. So, there you go. And finally, Infinity. What's notable about Infinity is that Infinity has some of really the highest priced figs on the market. Like, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news there, but it's absolutely true. And not to be a hipster, but I have loved Infinity and had my hackies since very shortly after the game came out. So I absolutely love this game. Please understand that when I say that, it's coming from a spot of absolute love. And I even remember talking about this, that what I loved about Infinity when I first picked it up many years ago was for around $100, I can put together basically my small playable force. You know, at $100, $150, I've got a pretty decent sized force on the table. And their rules are obviously free, which is cool. So I've been a fan of Infinity for a long time. But they do have expensive minis. I mean, when you look at this price per model, they are, you know, pretty high. Some of these, again, I just grabbed random stuff out of a few different armies, some Nomads, some Ariadna, some Hacky, some Panos, all fairly popular armies, at least around where I play. And, you know, when you look at these guys, they're very high price per miniature, much higher than pretty much anything Games Workshop is putting out, or at the very least equivalent to it. But I don't hear anybody complaining about the price of Infinity miniatures. And again, that's because, you know, for a full Infinity army, I don't need that many people. And so, again, it's about that total investment. And the reality is Warhammer 8th edition had a huge quote-unquote cost, not because Games Workshop's prices were too high. That is to say, they priced a box of 10 whatevers, X troop here, perfectly fairly. It's just, unfortunately, the game wanted you to have 40 of those guys, plus 40 more of another guy, plus blah, 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 blah. And that's what made it seem expensive. You know, we were talking about it in terms of the expense of the total game, when in fact, price per mini, it was quite a square deal. Games Workshop was honestly being very fair with their individual pricing, but, you know, so just to scan back up there, I mean, when you look at that and compare those two, Infinity's obviously a much more expensive game, price per model, but total investment is going to be way lower. So the last point I want to make is on some just sort of larger figures. Now, what I picked here is not monsters and stuff like that in most cases. What I picked here are just larger figures. And the reason I didn't pick big monsters is because, honestly, most of these other games don't do miniatures quite on the size of a lot of Games Workshop things. So, yes, in War Machine Hordes, there's the big Archangel, but, a lot of boards don't have that big giant monster thing on it. Whereas in Warhammer, there are really a lot of big, standout, ridiculously crazy big monsters, these giant centerpiece models. And trying to sort of price compare them is very difficult because a lot of other games don't have them. So like Infinity, for example, doesn't have some, there's nothing that's that huge roaming around the table. The biggest thing they have, they're basically like, the tags and stuff like that. So I kind of picked the tags to compare against just sort of the larger 40 or 50 mil guys or monstrous infantry to compare against, ogres and Kings of War and the larger singles in Malifaux. Malifaux is another game that doesn't have, really giant big monsters wandering around the table like we would think of. There's no Nagash level size monster wandering around or a Terrorgeist or something like that. So to keep it fair, I'm just kind of picking large-ish minis. This isn't going to be a completely fair comparison because we're moving away from something where there's really apples to apples, but I want to point it out again. When you look at this sort of price comparison, what you see once again is that, Games Workshop is honestly pretty fair in this comparison. Now, again, Kings of War is coming in way low. I actually picked two things here. One is their Draken Lord, which is a guy on a dragon, which sounds like a really large fig, but honestly, it's not that big of a monster. Like, it's a pretty small thing. And it's pretty squarely priced for a guy on a dragon. I mean, $30, I think, is actually a pretty good deal for that. And their ogre shooters, for example, which are their sort of lead belcher equivalent, $30 for 6 of those guys. At $5 a pop, I mean, that is just crushing everything else on this list. So I think it's really in this space where you see Kings of War actually leveraging it, because a lot of their larger or largish minis are in the sort of $30 to $50 range, and they tend to clock in pretty fairly in this comparison. But comparing it around to the other top games, because, again, Infinity, Malifaux, I see a lot of tread in both of these. I didn't go through and pull War Machine Hordes on this because I just didn't know enough to pull them, so I apologize. So if somebody wants to contribute some information on War Machine Hordes, I'm perfectly happy to take it and put it into this calculation. But my guess is it would come out much the same from what I've seen in looking at my friendly local game store. So when you look at it, I mean, Infinity is absolutely sort of, again, the highest price one. Malifaux tends to actually come in about the same as the Warhammer Fantasy stuff. Like Teddy is an easy example of kind of a larger guy, and he's about the same as all this stuff. Whereas like the Peacekeeper, the big, I want to say he's Guild Robot, it's 35, but he's kind of one of the larger things that Malifaux has. So again, that's probably not too exceptional. Once again, these tags are quite expensive by, just standard retail and how many you get. You get one guy in the box. In most cases, there are some other tags that come with differing things. But again, I just picked, what I picked. But I still don't see, I haven't heard, as I said before, that's the highest price per mini, but no one's complaining about the price of Infinity. Because again, if I only need a dozen guys on the table and I have one tag or two tags, I'm perfectly happy to make that investment because my total cost of investment is still low. So what does all this mean? What all this means is that I hope I've shown to you that Games Workshop's actual price of their figs is quite fair. What was creating the distorted perception that their prices were high was the sheer number of those figs that you needed, which should also then sort of explain, I think, their move with Age of Sigmar to allow a more varied number of models to participate in the game. You can play a fun game of Age of Sigmar with an extremely small number of figs. I played a game earlier tonight where one of the people had 5 figs on the table, and it was a great game. Okay, so At the same time, I've played with really big numbers of models, but it's the point being that they lowered the barrier of entry. I think that Games Workshop overall is leveraging their economy of scale to deliver what is a fairly reasonable by market value miniature. Again, I'll leave the quality of the sculpts out of it, but I'll let you decide on how you feel about that. Do you think the quality of the sculpts of Games Workshop miniatures are worth anything? Given if I would argue that they're pretty much at market averages. So if you think that their sculpts are completely average, then that's fair. If you think that their sculpts are of a higher quality, then that's probably actually turns that into a good deal. In either event, I hope that this was an acceptable response, Once Bitten, and that I've answered your concerns of why I think Games Workshop model prices are fair. And as I certainly think they are, I think they get a bad rap for this piece. There are plenty of things to be angry at Games Workshop about. I am not a booster for them in any way. I have a laundry list of concerns with them, but price is not one of them. So that brings us to the end of this little video. I'll actually stop screen sharing and say goodbye. Hello, everybody. I hope you found this interesting or entertaining or whatever. I hope that you maybe have seen Games Workshop's pricing in a new light. Maybe even if I didn't win you over, I hope I at least gave you some data to chew on. So that's that. I look forward to your comments below. I know this is a very hot button issue. You know, let's all try to have a reasonable conversation. I have certainly been fair to all these games because the reality is every game I talked about, I know the game and I like the game very much, and I like all these companies. And honestly, I want to see them all succeed because a healthy game market is the best thing for all of us. We have an embarrassment of riches right now in our game choice, and I love it. I've been wargaming for almost 20 years, and I don't think I've ever seen a more varied environment of choices. And I've never seen more games I want to play. My real problem is if I could just get somebody to sell me more hours in the day, I would be much happier. But until that happens, I'll see you next time.